Welcome back to our discussion about the book Christ Before Jesus. Now, if you don't know what Christ Before Jesus is, it's a book written by Jaron Wingo and Matthew Britt that claims to be able to use stylometry in order to not just show that Jesus and Paul didn't exist, but everything was written in the 2nd century. In the first video of the series, we looked at some of the problems with their marketing and just how it kind of shows that they don't really have a firm grasp on what stylometry is. In this video, we'll look at some of the concerns that they said that people might have about their data, and we'll show even further how they really don't know anything about stylometry or the history that they're talking about. So let's jump into this. One of the things that gave me some hopeful promise to Britt and Wingo's work was that they anticipated potential concerns others would have about their data. They wanted to provide some assurances that their analysis was legitimate. However, their answers to these concerns only raised further issues. Now, the first question that they tackle is about whether the texts they are using are too short. They attempt to justify their choice on running at a chapter-level analysis, but what becomes clear here is that they don't know the limitations of a stylometric analysis. That texts can be too short is even something that Britt and Wingo mention, and in order to calm such objections, they state that in some cases, such as 2nd and 3rd John, they combined the texts. Yet they implied that the average of 400 words per chapter in the Pauline texts was suitable. Is it suitable though? No, not even close. The first issue is that their numbers are way off. Along with the 2 epistles of John, they claim that Philemon also fell below the 400 word average. Yet that's not true. In most English versions of the Bible, Philemon is somewhere between 400 and 490 words. When looking at the Pauline text, this would actually fall within the average range, which is closer to right around 489 words. Now, just to be clear, this is on the lower end of the spectrum. Depending on the translation, this can rise to over 500 words per chapter on average. But maybe none of this actually matters. Maybe they were actually talking about the original Greek text. If we ignore the English and go to just the Greek, we get an average around 372 words per chapter. Philemon would be below this average, coming in at about 335 words, but it's not a significant difference. The difference is just about what the actual average word count is compared to what Britt and Wingo claimed it was. Now, to be transparent here, to get to the average that I'm using, I'm including all of the epistles that are traditionally said to have been written by Paul, excluding Hebrews. Could one get the average to be closer to 400 by excluding certain letters? Sure. And this is one of the problems that Britt and Wingo's work really suffers from. They are not clear on how they are coming about their averages or what they're including or excluding. But moving to a second point, even if we take an average of 400 words as being true, or even if we double that, we still fall short of the word counts that we actually need. To get an accurate read, we need around 10 times as many words to do a proper analysis. Looking at Eder, the creator of Stylo, in their 2015 article, Does Size Matter?, he argues that sample sizes below 5,000 words, quote, provide a poor guessing because they can be immensely affected by random noise, unquote. For samples below 3,000 words, he says the results are, quote, simply disastrous, unquote. The point of success that he found was between 5,000 to 10,000 words. Now, in a later study in 2017, Short Samples and Authorship Attribution, Eder does show that in certain cases, one can reduce the number to around 2,000 words, and at times one can get accurate readings with just that, but that is only when one is comparing a single text to an entire corpus. That's not what Britt and Wingo are doing. So in practice, what Eder is actually saying in the second article would be similar to taking the entire Pauline corpus and then comparing single text to the whole. As a further step, each text is then resampled multiple times. However, an important point here is that this method doesn't always work. First, for this specific method to be successful, you need texts that have a clear authorial fingerprint. In some cases, that just doesn't exist, and then much larger sample sizes are needed. Even then, correct attribution may still not work. Second, you need a sizable corpus known to be of a certain author that a text can then be compared to. You also have to know what category an analyzed text belongs to. And again, if the text being analyzed happens to lack a clear authorial fingerprint, regardless of it truly being by the same author, there is a severe risk of misclassification. So even though one could theoretically use a smaller sample size, which is still multiples higher than what Britt and Wingo suggest, it wouldn't matter here, as this specific sort of analysis isn't being used by the authors. Pivoting from here, we can also look specifically at most frequent words, or MFWs. In the 2017 article titled Understanding and Explaining Delta Measures for Authorship Attribution, published in Digital Scholarship in the Humanities, the authors found that with Eater's delta, it peaks around 1,000 to 1,500 most frequent words. Obviously, if the samples being examined are less than 1,000 words and the average closer to 400, this is going to be a serious problem. The research is quite clear here. 400 words is not enough. It's nowhere close to being enough. Yet this is something that Britt and Wingo appear to understand. Earlier in Chapter 7, when discussing the analysis that they ran on their own book, they state clearly that, quote, when a text or number of texts are too short for Stylo to analyze, they will cluster together far away from everything else, unquote. The chapters in their own book that they claim are too short was their notes from the authors and the introduction. Yet, the chapter Notes from the Author is 494 words, while the introduction is 434 words. Both fall within the average number of words that they claim the chapters they are using to analyze the Pauline epistles have. Both are longer than the text of Philemon, with even the introduction being just about 100 words more. Even in English, both works are longer than Philemon. Now, let's be fair here. At the beginning of the book, they do claim to be using the NIV translation, and in that case, Philemon is at 480 words, so more than the introduction, but still short of their note. Yet in Chapter 7, they also use the American Standard Version, which has Philemon at 438 words, so basically on par with their introduction. Clearly, there is a problem here, one that both Britt and Wingo acknowledge, yet they don't actually factor it in when it comes to their study. And that point really needs to be hammered home, as they state that those two chapters of their book were too short for Stylo. This in itself invalidates their entire argument. So let's just make this very clear. They are saying that chapters within their books that are more than 400 words are too short for Stylo. Yet, they also claim that 400 words on average is okay for the Pauline epistles. You can't have it both ways. They invalidate their entire argument. Now, one final thing before we move on to the next concern. As discussed, when looking at the most frequent words, to get an accurate read with Eater's delta, the formula that Britt and Wingo state that they are using, you need between 1,000 and 1,500 most frequent words. How many do the authors use? If the analysis they did on their own book is any clue, just 100. That's nowhere close to enough. Now, the second concern that the authors addressed was in regards to how they ran their analysis. They anticipated that some people would ask if they shouldn't have ran different variables. In order to counter this, they make the claim that they didn't start off trying to prove themselves, but they just wanted to see what they could find. Because of this, they claim that the approach that they developed came out of trial runs that they conducted and, quote, a number of academic papers regarding Stylo, unquote. So what did these trials consist of? It seems that they were largely just them playing around with Stylo. They claim to have ran every delta option and a variety of other options for n-grams, both for characters and words, as well as different most frequent word values. There's a whole lot of issue here though, and much of it comes back to transparency. First, we aren't told what academic papers on Stylo they're referencing. We're simply told that, yeah, they've done their research. In many ways, this seems like a logical fallacy. They're appealing to authority, but in this case, it's some vague sense of authority. What makes this all that much worse, though, is that the authors continually state that the reader can replicate their analysis and see if their results are accurate. Yet we aren't given any data that would allow us to do that. Having tried to look for some papers that dive into Stylo, I haven't found anything besides the documentations by the authors of that program. This is documentation provided by the authors on GitHub, which consists of a somewhat basic how-to manual. There is definitely an expectation here that you have some background in stylometry in general. So while stylo is still a relatively low bar for entrance into computational stylometrics, there will still be a huge learning curve, and simply playing around with a program will not suffice. Expanding my search outside of academic papers, I was able to find a few basic blog posts that mentioned some initial testing that people are doing, but didn't really dive into their methodology. In order to get some clarification on this, I did reach out to the authors. Their response did lead me to uncover 2 studies, but that was completely indirectly. However, largely, the answer that was given was the same that was in their book. They claimed they have a large folder on their desktop, but because people have tried to catch them in copyright violations for sharing their articles, they can't share anymore. The bigger issue, though, is that their response shifted the goalpost. And let's just be clear. This idea that they can't share the name of an article because they might be caught for copyright violations is nonsense. It was the dumbest response I've ever seen. And sure, I may be exaggerating a little bit, but seriously, that is just ridiculous. You can share an article and it's fine. You don't have to share the actual article with someone. Just give them the name of the article. That's really all you have to do. So this idea that they had, this excuse, was just BS. But ignoring that, like I said, the bigger issue here is that this response from them shifted the goalpost. Because in their book, they make the very specific claim that they used academic papers on stylo. In their response to me, they moved that claim to incorporate stylometry as a whole, as well as other analysis of text. Now, they did share 2 links to collections of works by the computational stylistic group, and these are the individuals who created stylo. However, those 2 collections are basically the same. They're both put together by that group. And the thing is, much of their work had nothing to do with stylo itself, besides basic introductions. Other pieces of their work were incredibly focused on interesting material, but that wasn't relevant here. Other portions were more focused on the topic of translation, which can be fascinating, but again, not really relevant, at least not in this specific example. Now, for anyone who would be interested in this sort of information, doing a quick search for computational stylistic group, GitHub, will get you to their site. I will also drop the link down below. And if you're interested in stylometry, I do highly recommend their website. In fact, it has been one of the sources that I frequently went back to while doing my own research. The problem for Britt and Wingo, though, is that most of the relevant information in these articles call into question their own methodology. If we recall back, Eder's own articles demonstrate that for an effective analysis, workout had to be multiple times higher than what these authors were trying to use. However, Britt and Wingo did send me one other link, and that was an article by Jacques Savoy titled Authorship of Pauline Epistles Revisited, published in 2019. Now, while this article does not mention stylo in any form, Britt and Wingo assured me that the author must have known about the program as they cited one of Eder's paper. Like always, there's a problem. The paper Savoy cited is the same 2015 article that I cited, the one that demonstrates that a length of 5,000 words is needed to make a reliable attribution. It is in this sense that Savoy even cites the paper, because he recognized that even the full text of the Pauline epistles were too short. In Savoy's conclusion, for this very reason, they state that, quote, these attribution results must be taken with caution, because 10 epistles over 14 have less than 5,000 words, unquote. So even the study that they gave me, that the one that they cited to me, tells us that their method is flawed. Now, ironically, this is actually the same paper that Richard Carrier goes over when he does a critique of stylometry, or at least computational stylometry. That paper, it talks about the good, the bad, and the ugly, and the reason it's ironic is because that ugly study that Carrier talks about is none other than Christ before Jesus. The bad ugly that Carrier talks about is actually Savoy's, and he points out a number of different flaws with that study. But either way, when we look at what Savoy actually had to say, It goes against what Britt and Wingo actually think. And yet, that's the study they actually sent me. So it should be clear that they're not only not reading the material, but they really have no idea what they're talking about. Now, complicating this is that Britt and Wingo's response to my email stated that it wasn't necessarily about finding a paper on Stylo, but more finding ones that use Stylo and then looking at that methodology. While Savoy didn't use Stylo, I figure it's fair to compare his methodology with that of these authors, as after all, they are the ones who suggested that study. Interestingly enough, according to Savoy and the Greek text that he used, Philemon is 388 words. Based on this, with it only being 12 words off of the average that Britt and Wingo claimed, there should have been no issue with running it in their analysis. Ignoring that, and acknowledging that Savoy's study would be different from what would be done on Stylo, we do see some glaring issues. Now, one, Savoy, when displaying his figures, includes the entire figure. He includes the entire graph. As in, he doesn't cut off the metrics, while Britt and Wingo do. Savoy explains on page 6 of his article that the distance between texts ranging from 0 to 1 highlights how similar there are. So texts at 0 are identical, while texts at 1 have nothing in common. Savoy relates a 1 distance to something similar to having one text in English and another in ancient Greek. Clearly, though, what this shows is that the distance scale tells us a whole lot. Why Britt and Wingo would cut it out is still a mystery. Savoy also argues on page 8 that a minimum of 200 most frequent terms is needed and somewhere between 200 and 500 is ideal. This, again, is in contrast to Britt and Wingo, who, as best as one can tell, based on the one full graph that they did provide, used just 100, half of what Savoy says that you need. Based on even just this small sample methodology, there are some clear issues. If Savoy is a legitimate study according to Britt and Wingo, and one should assume this because they in fact reference it, one comes to the conclusion that their own methodology is a bit sketchy at best, as it completely ignores what they highlight. But as I mentioned, there were actually 2 studies that I stumbled upon after speaking with Britt and Wingo. Both studies are by James O'Sullivan, with one being co-authored by Rachel McCarthy. The first study, published in 2020 by O'Sullivan and McCarthy, is titled Who Wrote Wuthering Heights? The second, published in 2021 by Jess O'Sullivan, is titled The Sociology of Style. What can we gather from these 2 works and how we should conduct our methodology? Well, again, it's not at all that promising for Britt and Wingo. Before we get into the bad, though, let's look at something that's a little bit more positive, or at least something that is similar. O'Sullivan does subscribe to the view that 100 most frequent words is enough. In his 2020 study, he does state that this is a theoretical view, and it's based on the ideas that using a small sample size of high-frequency words provides a sample of words that are, quote, especially resistant to intentional authorial manipulation, unquote. Here he is citing David L. Hoover and his 2009 article titled Word Frequency, Statistical Stylistics, and Authorship Attribution. The problem is that O'Sullivan is misrepresenting what Hoover said. The full quote adds the words, quote, it was assumed that their frequencies should be, unquote. Hoover goes on to say, in the introduction of his article here, that recent work has changed this. O'Sullivan repeats this claim in his 2021 article as well, misrepresenting Hoover in the same exact manner. So what does Hoover actually conclude? Larger word frequency lists almost always improve the results. Hoover states that in his earlier work, he had expanded his list up to 800 most frequent words, then up to 1,200, and then when working with long text, up to 4,000. This begins to fall in line with what we saw earlier, that with Eater's delta, the ideal was 1,000 to 1,500. This also falls more in line with Hoover's specific testing with delta, which shows that 2,000 most frequent words produce much more accurate results. Obviously, that isn't always possible with short text, but Hoover also shows that 700 to 800 most frequent words can greatly improve the results, but more words is still deemed better. On top of this, though, Hoover also describes other ways that he processes the text in order to remove some of the background noise. For instance, he talks about removing dialogue from novels as it prevents a number of problems, except when it doesn't, because it can add other errors or at times it can take away too much. He also removes pronouns, but he mentioned that that's not a standard practice. He also removes words that are frequent in a corpus just because it was an exceptionally high frequency in a single text. Doing such removes items that are closely tied to a piece of content, which can make a sizable shift. So for example, if you have a set of works by the same author, but one of those works is a genealogy, you might want to take some of those words out, such as son, or father, or begot, because those words are going to be repeated time and time again within that genealogy, but that doesn't mean that that is common words overall. Now, it appears that Britt and Wingo don't take any of this into consideration, as no culling seems to be occurring. But going back to O'Sullivan, moving past the most frequent words issue, he also states that their study uses support vector machine classification. SVM is a supervised machine learning algorithm. We don't need to dive much into this, as we can be certain that Britt and Wingo aren't using such. In a YouTube discussion with Godless Engineer, John Gleason, the authors make it very clear that what they are doing is, quote, not AI, it's not machine learning, it's not that kind of stuff, unquote. In addition, they also make it clear that they're not running supervised analyses, but instead chose to work in an unsupervised fashion, which outputs the graph, which visualizes the distance between texts, and then relies on a researcher establishing the meaning of the data based on the knowledge of that text. Now, ironically, one of the reasons that they claim to be using this method, as seen in that above interview, was that they wanted to reduce the amount of bias. But here, you're actually introducing bias because it's based on what the researcher is establishing and how they see the text. So that's just something that's worth pointing out here. Going back to O'Sullivan, in contrast to what Britt and Wingo are doing, O'Sullivan is taking the work of a known author and then he's running them against a disputed text. However, we do run into some problems here when it comes to Britt and Wingo's study. O'Sullivan mentions a few problems in creating a corpus, the primary one being genre. As opposed to Britt and Wingo's claim, O'Sullivan makes it very clear that genre can make text unsuitable samples. More so, he also highlights the fact that the size of the text do matter. Now, while he claims that in certain circumstances a word count as low as 1,000 can provide decent results, it's still imperfect. And even with that 1,000 word count, it is more than double what Britt and Wingo claim. More so, looking at another study by O'Sullivan, his 2014 study titled Finn's Hotel and Josian's Canon, he cites Eater, who posited the 5,000 word threshold while also stating that samples below 1,000 will not provide reliable results. From this, O'Sullivan claimed that the lowest reliable threshold was 1,000 words, which in his specific case appeared to work. But as he has to admit, there were limitations to his approach. Suffice to say, the methodology here does not appear to have influenced Britt and Wingo's work, and largely contradicts the effectiveness of their methodology, or what we can gather was their methodology. As a side note, O'Sullivan here does provide the metrics with his graphs, which again lends to the view that this was not a study that was used to inform Britt and Wingo. If we move to O'Sullivan's 2021 study, we see much of the same thing. In this case, known authors were examined to determine if families of writers shared similar styles, which was shown to be a tentative yes. This could in fact complicate such studies even more when dealing with works of debated or unknown authorship, as it suggests that authorial fingerprints may be shared to some degree. If so, they would call into question various views that Britt and Wingo have put forth, largely around the supposed uniqueness of a person's linguistic style. What all of this illuminates is that we cannot replicate or even really gain insight into what Britt and Wingo's methodology is. Instead, it highlights problems with the little we can garner about their own methodology. And beyond this, there is also reason to have suspicions about their understanding of stylometry in general. As I think has been demonstrated, the established methods and guidelines for stylometric analysis has largely been ignored by Britt and Wingo, but it goes further than that. For instance, on page 216, they make the claim that they ran every delta option in Stylo. Now, this is a slight thing, but it would be more accurate to claim that they ran every distance option in Stylo, unless they specifically meant that they ran each variation of delta, and it should be noted delta is capitalized as it's a proper noun. It's not a general term in the way that Britt and Wingo seem to have used it here. But if it's the case that they only ran variations of the delta measurement, why ignore other distant measures, such as Manhattan? Based on their phrasing and the setup of Stylo, it would appear that they simply assumed each distant measure was a delta option. After considering all of this, it's hard for me not to conclude that they simply found the setup that confirmed their views and ran with that. That in total, they don't fully understand stylometry or how to form a proper methodology here, which is why they seem to be evasive and vague. But on top of all this, they still make the claim that they, quote, were able to determine the most effective way for each language and not publish an image in this book that uses a method lower than 96% accuracy, unquote. They really bolster the idea that the results are reliable and that they ran the test in the best way possible. And to bolster this confidence a bit more, they even encourage their readers to follow up on their research. But the question here should be obvious. How? They don't explain their methodology. They don't give citations of the studies that they supposedly use to develop their methodology. As I've shown, the actual studies that use Stylo contradict the basic ideas that Britt and Wingo are suggesting. And the studies done on stylometry in general make it very clear that the little that we can actually glean about their methodology is simply wrong. Honestly, it would seem as if, in fact, they don't want their readers to try to replicate the results, but instead simply want people to take them on their word. Even in my own correspondence with them, while they claim this is easy, they also overly complicate the process. For instance, right before claiming that it's easy, they also stated that, quote, it took a year or two of studying the data science literature, sourcing and cleaning files, understanding the program both from a theoretical perspective and a hands-on approach, reading the program documentation, and even digging into the code base in order to develop our approach. We did not modify the software in any way. To get it up and running and test it is easy, but to actually work to validate and promote specific methods took a ton of work, unquote. So, it's easy, but it also takes years of work, especially since a reader of their book is really left on their own in order to create their own methodology and approach. And that to someone who has reached out and tried to get additional answers, something that they in fact encourage, the responses are vague and do very little to help clarify anything. Now, after going through all of this, and if you actually want to see the email exchange between us, I will post it in the links below. I actually decided to ask Britt and Wingo one final question. I was just looking for a bit of clarification about their methodology. To be honest, I expected more vagueness, and because of that, I asked more pointed questions. To be fair with Britt and Wingo, they finally answered all my questions in this regard. And even though I clearly disagree with much of their work, I do have to say that they appear to be rather friendly, at least to begin with. And even though I've dissected some of their responses in our email correspondence, they have shown somewhat of a willingness to actually have these discussions. Again, at least for a while. Because if you disagree with them or critique their work, all of that friendly nature simply goes out the window. So I do have to at least give them some props for that. As for their clarification on their methodology, though, it really didn't reveal a lot. So with all of that bluster, all of that research, everything that they did, what is their methodology? Well, it's basically the default procedure in Stylo. They used 100 most frequent words, either simple delta, no calling, and one-word engrams, which is what Stylo does by default. They don't sample anything either. If you were to open Stylo today, in order to get these settings, the only thing you'd have to change is the distant measure to either simple. That's it. So 2 years of study, all of the stuff that they dive into, all the research that they do, and what they tell you after you finally get the answer from them is that we just use Stylo on its very basic default settings. So yeah, for me, this is a bit wild, because why isn't this just spelt out in the book? It would be simple enough. Just use Stylo in its default settings. Why not be transparent about this? Well, because instead they want to make it seem as if their methodology is more in-depth, that it came from having studied other research and running a whole mess of tests. Yet, what they get to is basically open up Stylo and just run it on default. Now, one may be wondering, as I had, well, did they do any pre- or post-processing of the data? Nope, they did not. They state that the reason for this is largely because they didn't want to complicate the process any further, and they didn't want to do anything extra that would draw even more criticism. But doing a proper study would not have drawn any more criticism, at least not from people who were in the know, people who actually understood stylometry. Actually doing a proper research, a proper study, wouldn't have drawn more criticism. So this, to me, is just insane. But who knows? Maybe that very well is the truth. But it kind of seems like a crutch, an easy excuse that hides the fact that their study lacks in a variety of ways, while also trying to build up the idea that their study is legitimate. Because again, their methodology is nothing more than opening up Stylo, changing the distance measure, which is just a click of a button, and then running the program. And even then, they couldn't spell this out in their book. So for me, it raises some suspicions. But again, for the sake of this work, I will give them the benefit of the doubt that they're not just full on lying to people, that maybe they really do believe the stuff that they're putting out. But for now, this is the end of this video. In the next one, we'll look at some of their other concerns that they bring up. Now, if you like this type of material, if you have questions, please do contact me. I'm happy to answer any questions that come my way. And this is going to be part of a larger series, so I'll be looking at a variety of different Jesus mythicist claims, and we'll just be kind of going over them in time. So if you like this type of stuff, hit subscribe or whatever, and come along with me for this journey. Have a great day.